whatever you're going through is hurting you for a reason. And the reason is because you're attached to an idea that it should have been some other way. So that death of that fantasy is so painful, but it's so good for you to let go of that fantasy, that person, that relationship, that idea, that image. It's so good for you. You don't feel it now because it's been taken away from you. But once it's taken away, you realize that you can be without it and your life did not collapse. You begin to grow and become stronger and freer. So you're less in the grips of these fears in the future.
What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another mind and heart opening conversation on Just Tap In. Our guest today is a wisdom teacher, clinical psychologist out of Columbia University, and an acclaimed author on the topics of personal transformation, conscious parenting, and relationship dynamics. Not only is she listed on Oprah's Super Soul 100 list, but Oprah herself said that in the last 30 years of interviews, this woman is the best she's ever seen. Merging Western psychology and Eastern philosophy, Dr. Shefali Tsabary espouses a not only unconventional but also controversial approach to parenting that centers on children as sovereign beings and forces parents to look within and raise their consciousness. The Dalai Lama himself wrote the preface to Dr. Shefali's first book and has shown praise for her ability to bring compassion to the masses. She's spoken all over the world in high-level events such as TedX and Mindvalley, and holds a thriving private practice to guide individuals and families through the process of finding their authentic selves. Her newest book, A Radical Awakening, teaches us how to turn pain into power and find the courage to disrupt toxic patterns that are holding us back from living freely. Before moving on, if you love what we're building and want to help us land more paradigm-shifting guests like Dr. Shefali, the number one thing that you can do to support this show is to subscribe to this channel and like this video so that it gets shown to more wisdom seekers like you. Now, get ready to alchemize your rock bottom moments and embrace your truth with Dr. Shefali. Dr. Shefali, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here. It's a true pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we did this, we tried doing this once, and then the connection on my end was not working, but we're here back again, and we're going to be talking a lot about radical awakenings. This is a concept we always hear in the spiritual community, personal growth, and they're always telling us about awakening, the process of awakening. There's different phases to it. And I really wanted to get deep into your journey because in this book, you went completely vulnerable. You showed up and really communicated things about yourself that had to do a lot with your process of, becoming a seeker. And that's exactly where I wanted to start. One of the quotes that I really resonate with is, "When the student is ready, the teacher appears." Mm-hmm. And I think this is a book for people that are in that phase of seeking out. And I wanted to just begin by asking you, what does it mean to be a seeker in your life?
I think simply put, it means to look at all conflict and painful opportunities as lessons for growth and to really seek those lessons, to really try to discover what are these lessons trying to show us, what are they trying to reveal to us about our patterns, about our childhood baggage, our childhood wounds, so that we can begin to evolve with each painful experience into a better version of ourselves.
I love that. And you talk a lot about these masks that we all wear. And I think when we become aware that what we're showing up in the world as is not necessarily who we are, I think it's a huge paradigm shift. And I think that's something and a concept that you really dig deep into in the book. And you talk about the layers of the ego. Mm-hmm. Do you mind dissolving a bit about what the ego is? I think a lot of people are still trying to understand it because we hear a lot about that word. It gets tossed around a lot, but in your life, like in your journey, how have you discovered what that ego is and what it means to dissolve and peel back the layers?
Sure. So, because we are surviving the unconscious onslaught of our own parents, we as children develop this tough veneer or this shell. And we operate from that place because we want to be protected against the pain that we may experience because we're not being seen for who it is we are. So when we operate from that tough space, it's a protective space. It's a defended space. And that allows us to, bribe our way into getting love and worth that we ordinarily may not have gotten if we're just ourselves. That's what we think as children. Okay, I'm trying to get love as I am. It's not working. Let me put on this new face, this persona, this shell. Maybe then I'll get it. So some kids become over pleasers, or some kids become jokesters or comedians in order to get the love from their parents. And then we keep those faces of the ego. And then eventually in adulthood, it begins to show up as a dysfunctional pattern. It begins to show up as a faulty, negative pattern that actually brings us down. So then we have an opportunity as adults to go, wow, I keep doing this thing over and over. Where did I learn that this was the way to get love? How can I get love in a more constructive way? We're all just trying to get love. So how do I get love in a more productive and constructive way?
So we're going through, as you said in your book, we're going through this female renaissance. And that's a topic I wanted to explore a lot with you, about the awakened woman. What inspired you to start talking about and speaking out about the importance of women in our culture, in our society, to truly step into who they are without the patriarchy that's been plaguing our humanity for the past years?
Well, the patriarchy would be okay if it was a benevolent patriarchy, but it's a toxic patriarchy. So in my own life, I began to awaken more and more as my kid began growing older, and I began to find an identity beyond my kid. And I believe many women go through that when their kids begin to leave the nest and they begin to discover who it is they truly are, separate from their roles. So this is a typical journey in mothers, I think. So, I began seeing it more and more in my clients that as we hit our mid-40s, we begin to shed those false layers and seek a more authentic way of being. And so I wanted to speak to that in women and give women the permission and the platform and the tools so that they could do that. So my book, A Radical Awakening, helps women, young women especially, begin to walk on the path with more authenticity and more clarity.
And in one of the videos that I saw that you published, you were asked to describe 3 emojis that described your book. And one of those being the lotus right here in the cover of the book. I wanted to just ask you, why did you choose the lotus? What does it mean to you?
Well, the lotus is synonymous with being able to grow out of the mud. It has all these petals. It opens up and closes every day. And it's just symbolic of this process of evolution where we go back and forth, ebb and flow, and open into our highest potential.
And another one was the concept of the tunnels. And you talk a lot about that each stage in the book, each phase of this awakening is truly a portal of transformation. When we see that things around us in our life that are painful, that we are struggling with, like, for example, we might, attract a partner, we might attract someone in our life that is causing us to look at ourselves within. That's a concept of this podcast. We really want to enable people to have the tools and the wisdom to look within themselves. And I think it's just a perfect occasion that I came across your book. And I wanted to ask you, these tunnels of transformation, how can we become aware that we're inside one? And how can we become aware that, instead of going out of the tunnel before we hit that light, as you were saying, how do we just move towards that light?
Well, I think you're in a tunnel because you're in an unfamiliar, unknown place. So you're not in the past and you're not in the future that is known. You're in a transitory place. So that's how you know, oh, I must be in a tunnel in between zones, and something new is coming. But typically the tunnel is unfamiliar and scary because it's new, it's dark, it's unfamiliar, but also you're leaving the old part of you behind. And that is a very challenging, daunting experience. So as we leave the old behind, we, experience this kind of death and this grieving and bereavement. So all this needs to happen inside the tunnel as you let go of the old ways of being and enter a brand new, embrace a new way of being.
Yeah. And you were mentioning how this pandemic, that like the global situation that we're living in, has become this global tunnel of transformation. And you described in one of your Instagram lives was that we have to become aware of the mortality that exists in everything. Like every part of ourselves, will eventually have an end, and not just our whole life, but us, as people, when we evolve, when we grow and we become, just more conscious, more awakened. So in your life, I just wanted to quickly get some context and ask you, when you became aware of this mortality, how did your life change? How did, your perceptions of the world, of other people that were around you, how did that change for you?
Well, it's about the power of the present moment. So as you become aware that, philosophically, conceptually, and practically, that life is so fragile, you begin to zone into the present moment and live more in the here and now, and exist with a detached state of, this craving that we have to be someone great or to act great. You begin to realize that life is so transient and temporary. So there's no point to attach to something bigger than the present moment. So once you realize that, then you constantly work on letting go of your attachments that seem to be with your ego or with, creating a false sense of self.
I love that. And, when I was reading your book, one of the topics that was like the most powerful thing that I took away, and I was going through, a process in my life where I felt and I realized that I had been giving a lot of my power away to other people. And there was a quote that really stood out to me that I want to read you in the book that says, "No one loses themselves to another. They come to the other already lost." And, when we talk about relationships, I think much of your work is around dynamics between parent and children, between lover and other lover. And like, when we become aware that it's not really the other person that, is causing this pain, we go within it again and we realize like we came to this relationship maybe already with a void, or we came to this relationship with something within us that needed to be filled, and we sought that out in the external. And when you see this happening to other people, with your clients, and when you're on your, on your events and your lectures, what do you say to people when you really realize that they're just giving they're giving their power to someone else, to the external, or they're just a bit, lost in trying to find that in someone else instead of going within and feeling whole themselves and then seeking out, experiences instead of people to just fill that hole.
Right. It's hard for people to realize that. And it takes a lot of loss and a lot of pain for people to realize that they've been giving their power to someone on the outside. They get rejected a lot, or they get pushed on the side, and then they realize, wow, I'm losing my happiness and my joy because I've given it to this other person. And through pain and loss, you come back to your sense of self. You come back to, why am I giving my power away? I'm more worthy than begging someone to give me attention, to, give me time. We never should technically beg anyone to give us time or attention. And through the pain of not getting that over and over, one day we will wake up to that realization that we need to give ourselves the attention and the time.
You mentioned the concept of over and over, and you talk a lot about the patterns that we live. And there's another quote. It's, we don't live lives, we live patterns.
Right.
When you're encouraging people to break their patterns, or maybe we might not even realize we're in a pattern, or we realize sometimes when I'm in a situation with another person, I'm like, I get a deja vu because I'm like, I'm living the exact same moment with another person, just in a different mask or different suit, and they're just like a different person, but it's the same lesson. And I believe that we don't move on from that pattern until we look at the lesson. But how do we extract the lesson and in the moment, instead of having to relive? And I know you've been really inspired by Eastern philosophy, the concept of karma. How do we get out of that wheel of suffering and learn our lesson at the moment that we should?
It's not easy, but you try a little bit at a time, step by step. So, you realize, say, for example, that you're begging someone for attention. You're calling them all the time. So, you're like, okay, this time I'm not going to call them 50 times. I'm just going to call them one time. So you slowly wean yourself off your own pattern, but it's not an instant quick fix, all perfect, destination you get to just because you had an awareness. It takes time to wean yourself off your own addictive patterns.
And why do we become addicted to the pattern?
Because that's all we know. That's like our habit. And that's, what we hold on to give us that love and worth. It comes out of a desperation, out of a sadness, out of a longing. So we keep thinking that, if I just go to Timbuktu 10 times, I'll get something there. So you keep going to Timbuktu. You think that your manna from heaven is lying there, like from that compliment or that attention from somebody or that praise from somebody else. But then hopefully you don't get it, even though it's so devastating and painful, because then you realize you were on a mission that was faulty, that there was no way to get it in the first place because that person didn't give it to you freely. And if it doesn't come freely, it's not worth it.
Yeah. And one of the purposes, the main purpose of this show is to, bring people like you into this environment so we can collectively create this consciousness that's emerging, and one of the things that I wanted to ask you is this pattern that, men and women have lived throughout the last centuries that has really caused this toxic masculinity, patriarchy to emerge. And we're at the point where that no longer is functioning and no longer works. How can we get a new kind of paradigm shift for people to understand these dynamics and start breaking them little by little?
Yeah, I think the only way for oppressive systems to change is if, of course, the people who are oppressing wake up, but that doesn't happen because why would the people on top wake up? Everything is working great for them. So then the only other choice is that the burden of the change has to come from the oppressed, which is women in this case, or people of color, or Black people, or indigenous people. But it's so not fair because the people we're talking about who are oppressed are already downtrodden, and now you're asking them to make the change. But what to do? The change will not come from the oppressors because the oppressors are in a state of privilege. The change will only come from the oppressed and the downtrodden.
So when we're doing this conscious uprising that you describe, and we're looking at this time and people are awakening more and more, I think a lot of it has to do with awakening from the victim consciousness. And I wanted to ask you, this concept of being a victim plagues most people. Women, men as well. And how do we transition to what you call this victor consciousness so we can start, operating from a different awareness, operating from a different level?
I think when you realize that, you are basing your existence, joy, your happiness, your power on somebody else's level of consciousness. And the other person's level of consciousness is not that high. As long as we keep waiting for the other person to give us something, or life to give us something, and keep wondering when it'll happen, we stay in victim consciousness. The only way to switch to victor consciousness is to release our dependency on the other person's level of consciousness and not base our sense of joy or security on that other person. Only when we can switch out of that waiting and that dependency will we enter this victor consciousness.
And what is the victor consciousness look like for people?
Well, I think it's more accountable. It holds oneself accountable. It allows oneself to be responsible for its own joy. It understands that it's 100% a co-creator. It's 100% accountable. It may not be responsible. It's not responsible for global warming, responsible for its own rape, responsible for its physical abuse, but it is accountable in terms of making the change that needs to happen. So a victor consciousness is brutal in its adulthood, and it takes no prisoners. It says, I am 100% co-creator of my reality, and I must be accountable and fully responsible for the changes I need to make. I may not be responsible for the causes of everything in my life, but I'm responsible for all the changes that need to emerge.
What was the toughest part for you when you were writing this book? What part of the book did you feel the most discomfort in that probably led to the most realizations that you could have had when exploring all these concepts?
Well, revealing that my life was not perfect as people may have projected, or revealing that I had fallen into some traps of unworthiness. That was hard for me because I wanted to project an image of perfection. Who doesn't want to maintain that? And I knew that this book would shatter that in my audience's eye, and I had to sacrifice. I had to really ask myself, are you willing to let it go? Because I could have just hidden and pretended and allowed people to just think I was the perfect ideal that they were projecting onto me. So I knew that by writing this book, I would have to shatter that. And that was a choice I had to negotiate and overcome. And then once I did, I was so grateful and so happy because I realized that nothing really changed. I thought people were projecting. And even though people did project to a degree, they got over it as well. Because we're all willing and eager to let go of our ideals of perfectionism, either those that we project or those that we hold for ourselves. So people were relieved that I was just an ordinary, fallible person. And I was relieved that they were able to let that go. So I let it go, they let it go, and the world did not collapse. No one gave a damn. And that's a very freeing and liberating process to understand that your identity doesn't depend on these ideas that people have of you, and that you can begin to let go of those.
And you say that one becomes a million, right?
Right. Well, one is a million. One has the power, right? One choice, one change, one person, each thing can compound to a million. It's a powerful thing to make a change in the moment. It's a powerful thing to make a change as one person. That one person can have a drastic, huge difference. And that one moment can have a drastic, huge difference. So start with one moment, start with one day, start with one meal, and then branch outward.
Yeah. So for our listeners that are a bit skeptical about like that concept of they can impact a million lives, or they can actually have a change in other people, what would you say to a person that might, believe that what they do internally might not reflect in the outer world?
But it will reflect in the outer world. It may not reflect at the level and scale and depth that you want. So for example, just because you begin to meditate doesn't mean your kids are going to meditate. But because you begin to meditate, you begin to talk differently. So you have fewer conflicts. because you begin to meditate, you may eat better, so you spend less and your health improves. So there will be a change in the external, but the change may just be limited to you. And that's all we really want. We want the change to be for ourselves. So it doesn't really matter if our children change or our partner changes. It's important that we begin to see the changes in our own lives. And every small internal shift you make, 100% has a drastic effect in the external world.
100%. That's, when I'm 23 right now, when I started meditating when I was 21. My mom's a yoga instructor, sound healer. And I was exposed to a lot of that when I was, becoming an adolescent and in my teenage years, but I always ignored it. I always kind of said to my friends, oh, my mom's just a bit weird. We lived in California for some time. And really, when I was in college, I had this massive shattering of my ego, this ego death, because I came into college and I was basically trying to fill this, ideal of what a college dude should be when he gets to college. Of course, going out and having, a bunch of meaningless hookups that later don't matter in the next day, and you feel guilty about yourself. And then the ego death came, and it was this rock bottom moment that a lot of us, when we go through a rock bottom, we don't necessarily know what to do with that. And, if we don't even have the resources, if we don't have books like these, if we don't have online mentors, and this rock bottom just happens to us, what's the right way to, I know there's not a right way to approach it, but what would you tell someone that may be going through a rock bottom right now? And they're probably here because they want to listen to wisdom and they're seeking. But in the beginning, you feel very, very alone when you're in that, process of breaking out of the matrix, as you say.
Yeah. So I think rock bottoms are really painful and so isolating, lonely making, like you said. And you feel like nobody in the world has ever been through one like you, and you will never get out of it. But having lived a little bit, you know that they all change and you begin to change with them. So my only piece of advice to someone is, whatever you're going through is hurting you for a reason. And the reason is because you're attached to an idea that it should have been some other way. So that death of that fantasy is so painful, but it's so good for you to let go of that fantasy, that person, that relationship, that idea, that image. It's so good for you. You don't feel it now because it's being taken away from you. But once it's taken away, you realize that you can be without it and your life did not collapse. You begin to grow and become stronger and freer. So you're less in the grips of these fears in the future.
Yeah, I love how you described growth in the book and in other interviews. And it's not necessarily about the process of adding more to you. How do you describe growth nowadays?
Growth is not an additive process, right? So we think when you grow, you add more leaves, more age, more wisdom. But real growth is a subtractive process. It's detractive. It's when you let go, when you lose things, when you surrender, when you release, when you shed, when you grieve. True inner growth happens through the letting go, not through the adding on.
And when we're coming to an experience and we don't know how to react to it, there's three big choices that I love that you described. And what are these choices that we have when we find ourselves in an experience, in a situation with another person or a job or, a teacher, whatever it is? What are these three choices when we feel that we're not being honored for our essence and we may be giving our power away to that other external?
The most extreme and drastic one is that you can leave the situation. So you can leave the job, you can leave the country, you can leave the neighborhood, you can leave the family.
Yeah.
So that is the most drastic, but we should do that one later. The first one is you ask yourself, can I just accept? Like, am I just resisting it because I have a fantasy that's not coming true? How can I just accept? If you can't accept, then the next level is to change. Change who? So you try to change the other person. Then if they don't change, you change yourself. And if it still doesn't work, like you change yourself, but you're still being abused, you change yourself, but the person still doesn't honor you, then you can go to level 3, which is to leave. So it's change, accept, it's accept, change, leave, right? So that's how you try to think, okay, can I accept it? Who can I change? And then if nothing changes, can I leave? And what does that mean?
I think the hardest one for people out of those 3 choices is having to change the other person. And that's the one that we probably most go towards, like the one we most, default to is, it's not about me, like this person's like this, so I'm going to try to change this aspect in their personality because I don't like it and it's not fitting me. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is the hardest one, but that's where we go first. And then we realize quickly that is the most stupid place to begin, because the other person, unless they're very open and enlightened, are not going to change. So the other person is not going to change. It's only, then you realize, oh, I have to do the work, and you come back to yourself and you're disappointed, but at least there's some power there. At least you're like, okay, what are my choices? What can I do differently? That will change the dynamic.
And the last one is to leave.
Yeah.
Leaving,
it takes the most courage and it's the most drastic. But I always tell people that sometimes leaving is the easiest. I'll just leave and abandon the situation. But leaving should be after a lot of premeditation, out of a lot of sitting, contemplation. We shouldn't just leave the situation. We should wait and see and sit with it and really make sure we're not running away, because leaving can actually be a disguise for just fleeing and running away. So we don't want to do that. We want to leave with consciousness, with a sense of wholeness, not out of desperation because we can't stay.
Would you say if we leave too soon, because this is a belief that I was raised with, like, if you start something, you should finish it. And maybe that whole belief may be misinterpreted because, for example, if you're in a job that you don't like and you're constantly just having to go through the motions, you don't feel any purpose, you don't feel passion, would you just stay there until who knows when? And that's,
I think stay till the project is finished. It doesn't mean you stay there till the external project is finished. You stay there till your emotional connection to it is done. That's what it means to stay. Now, of course, we teach children, finish the task. That's different. We're talking about bigger purpose, where you stay till you have an emotional connection. If the emotional connection is done and dead, then why would you stay?
Wow, that was powerful. I mean, so the emotional connection that we have to situations, how do we know? Like, because obviously we might still feel something for our past. We might feel something for an ex or a relationship that didn't work out. When do you know that there's no longer an emotional charge, or will there be for some time? How does that process look like? I'm really curious.
Well, I think you just have to be honest and look within and ask oneself from inside, what do I honestly feel? And hopefully you will be able to understand from your own self-awareness and self-knowledge that, it's finally over and I'm finally releasing that and I'm moving on, or I still have an emotional connection and a charge and I need to stay. Only we ourselves can decide if we have that emotional connection or not.
And when we still feel it, like when we feel that emotional connection, I'm very much emotions driven. I'm an emotion driven person. And, when I go through a situation in my life, I really have to, and sometimes we have to use our logic as well to make decisions. That balance between the masculine, the feminine energy, how do you approach it when sometimes the situation might require more logic than emotion, or vice versa? as well?
Yeah, it's hard. It depends how you are in terms of your own self awareness, knowledge, and integration. You
Mm.
know, those who have done more work on themselves can do it faster, quicker. Every logical and emotional decision involves the mind and the heart. So you
Mm.
want to be able to go between both of them to arrive at a holistic, complete, integrated answer. It's
Yeah.
not one or the other. You have to find a way to
Yeah.
balance both and to sit in both houses, the mind and the heart,
Mm.
sufficiently in order to come to a whole decision.
Yeah. One of our other mentors who's been on the show, Dr. Joe Dispenza, he says the heart-brain coherence, right? And sometimes we're more driven by the mind, sometimes we're more driven by our heart. But I think it's that balance that we get to achieve when we're having an experience that allows our soul to really learn from that and that event and that moment.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And you there is no escaping that mind heart coherence. You have to be able to move between both so that you can use logic and rationality, but also use compassion and feelings to maneuver your way through a quagmire or a dilemma. It cannot just be only rational. It cannot just be heart based. You need to balance both so that you can have wisdom and compassion when you go through a problem.
How do you gain wisdom? Because, when you see a child, when you see, someone very young, there's just a lot of wisdom there. Like, you always hear stories about how a 3-year-old said this, or I don't know if people can we talk at 3? But I'm just saying, like, in general, when we're really young, we say these things that come from a very pure source. For you, like, now that you've been on your journey and you want to gain wisdom, how does that process look like for you?
Yeah, it's returning to the building blocks again and entering the present moment and deconstructing the patterns over and over, because the work doesn't end. So it's coming back to the present moment and coming back to, understanding why you've been triggered, what are the patterns. And that's how you gain wisdom. Over time, you become better at understanding yourself and knowing yourself. It's not a one-stop shop, and it's not something you can get in one stop. It's several versions, years, decades that you have to keep staying on top of yourself and doing the work.
You're a clinical psychologist, Dr. Shefali, but you're very, influenced by spirituality and Eastern wisdom. How does that world relate to being a clinical psychologist? How have you integrated those two in a unique way that's helped, clients and millions of people all over the world?
Yeah, it's it's understanding the family patterns, which is more Western psychology, and then understanding how people get caught up in those moments and live in the past and don't live in the present. I've developed this whole system and I teach it to many coaches in my coaching institute. So if people want to learn how I work with people, they can come to my coaching institute and develop their own practice. But it's effortless in a way, and it works really well. Western psychology talks about going back to the past, and Eastern spirituality talks about coming to the present. So you can integrate both, because both are important in order to understand the self.
Yeah. And where does the future come in that?
It doesn't really, because the future is completely fictional. It doesn't exist. And often we enter the future in worry, in anxiety, with a foreboding that things are going to go bad. So the future we want to stay away from. The past can teach us. The present is where we want to live, and the future-based thinking we want to do as little of, because it's so out of our control that there's no point even going there.
Ooh, that's really interesting, because right now a lot of people, young people that are listening to this, are building their career, their next few years. Right now, I'm also doing a lot of, manifestations things and placing goals in my way so I can achieve those things. And so that's really interesting that you're talking about that. So how should we, going deeper on what you're just saying, the future, how do we kind of detach from an outcome or a specific manifestation that we want to, achieve or attract, the law of attraction, things like that? Like, I just wanted to go a little bit deeper into that.
Well, so if you have a vision for the future, but you want to manifest it and you want it to come true, you cannot do it by living in the future. You have to bring whatever you think is amazing in the future and ask yourself, how can I show up for that dream in the now? So unless you bring it to the present moment, it'll just be a fantasy and it won't be practical. You have to bring it into the future. So if you want your partner to be more patient and more understanding, you can keep working on them, but unless you become it more, they won't even have a chance. If you want to make $1 million in the future, what's the point of thinking about it in the future? You have to ask, how can I make $10 today? Right? So you have to always break it down to, okay, how can I show up for that same vision myself in the present moment? So it is narrowing down that big way of thinking for the future and bringing it into the present moment, right here, right now, asking what about that future can show up in the present or in myself.
That's powerful. And just moving on to, we'll start wrapping up. And I wanted to ask you, when you organize the book, you use the word matrix a lot. And, there's a new movie of The Matrix coming out soon. So I'm really excited about that. But, this is a word that gets tossed around so much again, like the ego. And, when I approach matrix, I also relate it to, the illusion that we live in. And, you named your daughter Maya for this reason. I wanted to let you unpack why you decided to choose those words.
Because I named her Maya, which means illusion, because I wanted to remind myself, and I'm using my daughter to do that, remind myself not to get too attached to my own belief systems or my ideas, because they always get me into trouble. Because too much attachment then creates an expectation, which creates a desire. And then if that doesn't come true, then you're in the gutter of disappointment. So to remember that we are, dying, none of this is important, and to let go of any expectation, it keeps you wise, keeps you empowered, keeps you free of the clutches of that thing, so that when it doesn't come true, you're not devastated.
So it's a bit of the concept of like detachment, right?
Right. It's more about being present in the moment. So it's instead of detachment, which sounds like you're not really present, you flip it to, how can I be more present in the here and now?
Okay. Got it. So where can people find your book? Where can people, that want to connect further with you, where can they find you, Dr. Shefali?
They can go to Dr. Shefali, spelled DOCTOR, on Instagram, Dr. Shefali, or to my website, dr for drshefali.com.
And I've heard you have some plans in 2023 for a new book. What can we expect? Without any spoilers.
It's just a book on really giving parents a method. Many of my parents have often asked for a method, and I've resisted giving them that, but now I'm ready to give them a method to parent. And if people want to become coaches, life coaches, conscious parenting coaches, they can join my institute. And the best way is to go to my website to explore all that.
That's awesome. And when we're wrapping up the show, we have this segment called the Final Trio. We have a couple just quick, like rapid fire questions, however long you want to make them. But the first one that I wanted to ask you was, if you could describe the main characteristics of humanity that we will see during this time of the awakened woman, what would they be?
More authenticity, more compassion, more female leadership.
I love that. What has been your biggest lesson for awakening to your authentic self in the past 12 months?
To let go of this idea that there's a perfect way to be.
And the final one, what wisdom do you want to leave on the young generation of seekers and future leaders of the world?
to dismantle rigid institutions and not prescribe to a particular way of being.
I like that. Dismantle the institutions. How does that look like? Without violence, or maybe there's a bit of chaos.
Well, you don't
too.
subscribe to it. You don't believe in the big institutions. You can participate, but you don't believe in them. And you enjoy them and you have fun with them, but you're not subscribing to them.
Yeah. And I'm so optimistic for the future. Like, we look at things like right now, decentralized finance, which is a topic that we're going to explore more on this podcast, because I feel it's super important. And, this is what this show is meant to be. It's, about dismantling the paradigms that we have right now and the old paradigms, and allowing the new to come in, hopefully with less chaos, more order. But I know we will see some chaos in the next years, but it's going to be very beautiful. So Dr. Shefali, I'm really grateful for this time that we shared. Thank you so much for being so open for this invitation. And I know
Thank you for having me, Emilio.
Yeah. All the love. And I hope we can do this again, Dr. Shefali.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you so much.